For someone who is not a Mormon, what matters most about Joseph Smith is how American both the man and his religion have proved to be. So self-created was he that he transcends Emerson and Whitman in my imaginative response, and takes his place with the great figures of our fiction, since at moments he appears far larger than life, in the mode of a Shakespearean character, so rich and varied a personality, so vital a spark of divinity, is almost beyond the limits of the human, as normally we construe those limits. To one who does not believe in him, but who has studied him intensely, Smith becomes almost a mythology in himself. Harold Bloom, The American Religion. And welcome, everyone. You are listening to A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm Willie Grills here with Zelwyn Heide to talk about the life of Joseph Smith, the founder of the Latter-day Saint movement. Zelwyn, how are you?
I'm doing well, Willie. I am enjoying some somewhat mild weather today. Again, it's just kind of been a mild winter so far. I'll admit I'm kind of looking forward to getting into this subject, although maybe not with the same enthusiasm as you.
Well, it's kind of funny. I was looking, we're doing these readings at the beginning of the episodes, and usually I can sort of play off things when we're doing the Bible or, some great Lutheran history in America or something like that. Then I come to Joseph Smith, and I'm like, nothing I can say here is going to be construed correctly. So I need to just be careful there. So let's just go right into it. We got our first major snow of the season, so that was nice out in the country. Things get a little dicey, kind of last on the snowplow routes, but everybody's good, wintering, so not too bad. So why do this Joseph Smith episode? Some of you might be wondering. Zelwyn, why are we doing it? Why are we talking about this guy?
We have talked quite extensively about the Second Great Awakening in a previous episode, and we're kind of building up, as Willie said in our first episode of this season, kind of a tapestry about that time period. And if you're really going to deal with the Second Great Awakening, you really cannot get away from dealing with Mormonism.
Right.
And Mormonism continues to be a tremendous influence in the American scene. And it is something that even the average layman is going to have to deal with from time to time.
Right. With this study, we're taking these deeper dives into history this season. We saw it a little bit with the Tennessee Synod, and we're going to see it in other episodes as we look at specific documents in the Tennessee Synod, for example, or, in the future, we're going to tackle pietism. You're going to get some deep Egyptian history, some Hotep postings. So that's what we're going to do here. It might be too detailed for some of you. It might not be enough information for others. What we are going to try to avoid, though, is, sensationalism, inaccuracies when we can. It's impossible to do history and not be biased. There's no such thing as truly unbiased history. That said, I think we can try to be fair when we need to be and use the best sources that we have. When we're dealing with something like Joseph Smith, we do, for all intents and purposes, have access to the sources, and certainly more than today than we had in decades past. So we need to be fair there. So there are some sources for Mormonism that I would suggest you avoid, and I'll mention those as we get there. Sadly, some of these sources continue to be among the most popular, but this isn't our only Mormonism episode. We're focusing just on the history of the life of Joseph Smith this episode. Then we're going to look at later historical developments and then dedicate an episode, at least one episode, to actual Mormon doctrine, which has changed over time. It has developed, sometimes, I think, actually contradicts itself. And so if we build on this bedrock from Joseph Smith, say, to Brigham Young and others, we'll trace that development and have a better apologetic, and if not that, at least a better understanding of the movement.
And it really comes down to, if you're going to be dealing with people and dealing with that apologetic task, it does nobody any good to come up and try to tell them, okay, I know what it is that you believe and I'm going to tell it to you.
Right.
It really is the best course of action to try to seriously understand where someone is coming from so that then you can then speak truth to that situation. And Mormons do come out of a very colorful and a very frankly, interesting past that we really do need to know something about in order to speak to them and to speak the gospel to them as well.
Absolutely.
Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, the study is very interesting in and of itself. And it is so intricately related to the study of American history as well.
Right.
A movement like the Latter-day Saint movement is able to flourish in a country like the United States in the time period that it does, where it couldn't have in other places at the time. Although, admittedly, they do have missionaries in Europe and some success elsewhere, but it really couldn't have been born anywhere else.
Right. Or, frankly, at any other time.
Right. So we talked about the Second Great Awakening a little bit, or you mentioned it at the beginning, and how this is tied. So we think often about the revivals of the Second Great Awakening, the new measures, that kind of thing, playing on people's emotions, getting them worked up, these mass conversions that often don't lead to long-term spiritual effects. But also tied to the Second Great Awakening is this idea of restorationism. Zelwyn, you want to try to tackle a definition of restorationism?
Oh boy, yeah, that's a broad subject. Restorationism, I think, in its most basic sense, would be an attempt to go completely back over history and to attempt to restore the pristine New Testament church in one way or another.
Yeah.
So it's not like you're reforming things and trying to fix where it had gone wrong. It's just saying it's completely wrecked. We need to start over.
And there tends to be two types: the Christian primitivism way, which wants to strip everything away and just come down to what they see as this sort of pure, unadulterated, original Christianity. So basically, they would see liturgy and ceremony as things being tacked on, unnecessary, the creeds as being unnecessarily divisive, but just trying to distill it down to something simpler. So that would be the primitivism. The other side is this revelatory or prophetic restorationism, which is what you have with Mormonism, wherein God is giving new revelation and new vision. Both camps tend to agree that there's this great apostasy, that the church falls away to one degree or another, to where you have someone like Campbell or even like a landmark Baptist would say, well, there were still believers sort of all throughout history, but they were very small in number. But if you look at the claims of Joseph Smith, the church had completely fallen away and had to be restored by a new revelation.
Right.
And so it's a question of degrees, but the general idea is that the church has lost her way or is completely gone and now must be restored. It's interesting. It's all tied up with millennialism, this idea that the end of days are coming, Christ's kingdom on earth is going to be here. It's going to be a literal kingdom, and we are the ones tasked with bringing in that kingdom. It's a theology of optimism, but it ultimately leads in failure. You're going to see that in all of the restoration movements. World War I really puts the nail in the coffin on sort of an optimistic post-millennialism in American Christianity.
Right.
But nevertheless, that's the climate into which Joseph Smith is born. Joseph Smith is born in 1805, New England area, and revival is everywhere. The country, like today, is still very rural, but revival has taken over the place. And we think about these great revivals, but we forget that along with them are hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller little revivals springing up in all these towns. We kind of see the vestiges of that in these churches that have a revival season, or you'll see a church sign like revival June 5th through the 7th from 7 to 8. Like how do you? That's some good planning.
That's great planning. The Holy Spirit's coming down then, so let's do this.
Right.
Well, and I think it's also, we should note there with the revivalism that was springing up and all these littler ones too, there was kind of creating a climate of distrust, because one would come in and they would have a revival and they'd say one thing, and then another charismatic figure would come in and he'd have a revival and he'd say another thing. And so it all just kind of starts to burn out, as we described it in the other episode. And
not only that, but it's this continual erosion of confidence in the traditional denominational structure.
Right.
So that the only people who really have great success are the Methodists. The Presbyterians who have great success are the ones who really reject what would be historic Presbyterianism. The Methodists have some success, revival, and I'm speaking not doctrinally, broadly. They have their success because of the Methodist model, and they're able to go out. But really, it's kind of an independent movement, especially in the Second Great Awakening. Like, you do have the established church in the First Great Awakening pushing against men like Whitefield and everything, but that's really still before disestablishmentarianism. You still have the established churches. Well, now we're post-American Revolution. We're way past it. Well, yeah, way past it. That's fair. The idea of having an official church and established denominations are really odious to a lot of Americans. And they still are, quite frankly.
Well, and that whole environment of the denominations being odious and also these different revivals coming in and one person saying another thing and another really causes, I mean, if we're coming back to Joseph Smith, causes his parents, Joseph Sr., not that that's ever going to be confusing,
right,
and his mother, Lucy, to become fairly distrustful of the whole thing. And so they do tend to gravitate towards their own visions, their own ideas.
So Joseph's father is something of a nonconformist himself.
Right.
So that gets handed down. Lucy, Joseph Jr., so Joseph Smith Jr. is who that's the prophet. That's who we refer to as Joseph Smith. That's Joseph Smith Jr. His father is Joseph Smith Sr., and his mother is Lucy Mack Smith. I forget, I gotta actually lay down those terms here. So Joseph Sr., then you have Lucy, who really is, for a time, interested in Orthodox Christianity or established Christianity, but never seems to make it work. When they're in New York, she feels kind of dejected by the Presbyterian Church, which is the main church in the village there. She attends Methodist camp meetings. She attends revivals there. Joseph Sr. tends to stay away, and the boys, as boys do, tend to go along with their father. And that family dynamic in the Smith household is very interesting. So eventually, they're really, as you say, following their own ways, and folk practices become a big part of what they do. They're a pious family, in a sense. They are concerned with spiritual matters, but they're never really convinced of one denomination or another.
Right.
So they are independent, and that really kind of develops in the family there.
Well, and that folk practice that you referred to there, I think, is also kind of informative for us in understanding Joseph Smith. Folk practices being, of course, things that we might consider strange.
Strange. This is something, okay, so we're jumping the gun a little bit, but when people talk about the translation of the Book of Mormon, we know, either through basic religious education or through that one episode of South Park, that Joseph used a seer stone or the Urim and Thummim to translate the Book of Mormon. That's how the story goes.
Right.
So the seer stone, what is a seer stone? Well, it's basically a rock that you look into that would show you where hidden things were. And we see that and we go, okay, so he's some sort of witch, so he's practicing magic. And for years, we wrote about how the Smith family were involved in all kinds of these devious activities where they would take the stone and try to find treasure. And it was just this really nefarious scheme they came up with. But what we forget is, and especially in the last 20 or 30 years, there's just been a wealth of historical information. And that really puts them in context, is their belief in seer stones, folk magic, is not uncommon at all. That's not something that would have been unusual to the people of their village.
Right.
So seer stones, dowsing rods or witching rods, all those kinds of things, which we would rightly be uncomfortable with, are just the reality of rural Christianity in America at that time, and really rural Christianity in Europe. That's what you have. So dowsing rods, for example, they're not necessarily used to conjure spirits or anything. They're used to find where to dig a well, for example. And a seer stone would be the same thing. That's what these men would use seer stones for. Now, did they work? That's always the question. To what degree are these witchcraft? That's what we can't answer in this podcast. But the point is that these are not uncommon in Joseph Smith's day.
Or in his family.
Or
which
in his
is what
family.
I was getting
yeah.
at.
In his family. Yeah. His family, this is perfectly normal. Now, what rubs us the wrong way is that he's, at least a few times, Joseph is part of money diggers. He grows up hard. The family's poor. They don't have much of a reputation. There's a history of Joseph Smith Sr. always having financial issues. So they're always struggling to make payments on loans. They're always, they lose their house at one point. They lose their farm more than one time. So they're moving constantly from house to house. Joseph Smith, as a young boy, is subject to typhoid, or is it typhus? Gets in his leg. He has this traumatic surgery. He's basically an invalid from, say, age 7 to 10. His bond with his parents becomes very strong there. Through these accounts of that, the hard childhood, you're getting this picture of the family as very close, but they've also been through a tremendous number of difficulties. Mm-hmm. So they try to make a go at it at farming, but then on the side, eventually, they have this money digging operation, and Joseph falls in with the money diggers. That's never a full-time job that he has. It's never like he said, I'm going to go be the chief money digger in America or anything like that. It's this practice that he engages in on the side. Eventually, he does get arrested or brought up on charges for being a disorderly person, which money digging could be included in that, what that means.
Sure.
But he had a reputation that was strong enough that he got more than one person to pay him to try to find treasure on their property, right? So, take that with a grain of salt. But this is this idea of magic and earthly elements to see hidden things is very important to early Mormonism and not something strange to his family. So that, as we're going to see, when he's later translating the Book of Mormon using a seer stone, that's why we don't have many accounts of his family blinking or his friends blinking, because it's Joe Smith, and he has this gift with seer stones. Wasn't the only person in his village who was alleged to have this gift either. The sister of one of his associates as well, she had some other kind of glass. She looked in and claimed to be able to find stuff. Again, I'm not saying they were able to. That's weird. I mean, it's something that's really quite different for us. We had this in, growing up in Appalachia, and stories from my grandmother. People use dowsing rods to dig wells and that sort of thing. So the folk ways live on, and people do believe in them.
Right.
And so whatever that means. But putting him in his context, you have this strong religious fervor in America at the time, especially in rural America. You also have a strong rationalism that's growing, but you have the old world folk traditions still apparent there. And that's extremely significant for understanding Joseph Smith and the other supposed prophets of his time.
Yeah, and my point with bringing all that up is not so much to just say, oh, see, we got him kind of a thing, because that's not doing good history.
No, not at all. Yeah.
The point in bringing it up is to show, as you rightly said, that Joseph does come from an environment in which all of these things kind of shape him. The distrust of the organized denominations, the practice of folk magic or folk practices, as well as his general poor upbringing, which would we say that his father's trouble with money translates over to the son later in his life as well?
Yeah, he's going to have, he comes to Kirtland, Ohio, and in a real estate boom and a banking, the market's really up, and he's in many ways the victim of failed capitalism too. So, and we might get into that. We're a little behind the 8 ball on this episode already, but if we get that far into Kirtland, we can talk about that. But yeah, that does follow him. That's kind of funny. That really flies in the face of Joseph Smith did all this to get rich, because he doesn't.
Because he never really does, yeah.
He never really does, and he never really has it that easy, except for, certain periods here and there. There's a few years of tranquility, which I think, that should shade our interpretation. He's not a Benny Hinn. He's not a Creflo Dollar or a Joyce Meyer or insert any prosperity preacher there. You don't get that. His early followers are all very much like him. Poorly educated, rural farming types from America and Europe. That's who he attracts. He's not a cosmopolitan. Mormons at that time are not cosmopolitan.
Not even the least.
So yeah, he is the product of this environment, and he is able to attract those people. It's really funny. He's not educated, but he does seem to be able to talk his way into a lot of things and to convince people of a lot of things. So he is very clever. He's very extroverted. He's a big guy for his time. Over 6 feet tall. He's just a character. And so it shouldn't surprise us. We can look back at the history, and our history is so reductionistic about this. And we use so many bad sources because of, certain evangelical Christian publishers, and that we don't get this complete picture. So we go, well, how could anybody follow this obviously false story? And this guy, who walks around with a limp from a childhood surgery, how could this guy be impressive? And he's impressive enough to get thousands of followers in a very short time. And
Right.
how was he able to do that? Well, I guess we'll talk about that, in segment 2. I think a big part of it is he's able to communicate in the language of his people. He's able to give them a narrative, and he's able to present that narrative in a very compelling way. And we can't discount that. If salesman or not, you can't discount it. I would say what is there for us to learn there, but that's probably not a good question.
We'll wait on that one.
So that's the Joseph Smith. That's his immediate environment. Rough life, rural America, from Vermont, New Hampshire, up to New York, which is what we're going to see next. He's in New York for a long time, then Pennsylvania, Ohio. So we'll take a quick break, and then on the other side, we'll talk visions of God, visions in America in general at the time, and the Book of Mormon. We'll be right back with more Word Fitly. All Scripture is God-breathed and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be competent, equipped for every good work. Visit our website, wordfitlyspoken.org. There you'll find new articles each week on the Bible and other topics. You can also join us on Facebook at Word Fitly Posting. That's Word Fitly Posting with a P, to discuss anything you've read or heard. Thank you for listening. We'll be right back with more Word Fitly Spoken. We are back. You are listening to Word Fitly. Willie Grills and Zelwyn Heide talking the life of Joseph Smith. So that first segment was fun, Zelwyn.
It was. I mean, we covered not a whole lot of ground, but we covered it in great depth, which I think is always fun. So
we got about 12% of what I wanted to, but that's all right. It's a when you study this part of history, and especially something as a character as contentious as Joseph, there's just so many different avenues you can go down, and we just don't have the time, in 1 hour to cover it.
Right.
So now we're going to talk about, though, something significant, and that is Joseph as a visionary. And what I mean by that is not like Steve Jobs, like throwing like his old cell phone down and saying, hey, put all my songs on it, but actually God giving visions to people. Now,
Right.
This was not uncommon. There are newspaper accounts of people receiving visions in the village that Smith lives in. God and Jesus Christ, as it's sometimes put, and I'm going to use the terms that they use, even though they're really weird to us, and then that's intentional. They'll say things like, God and Jesus Christ came to me. And then you're like, okay, so was it just Jesus or so it hits our ear wrong, but they'll say things like that and revealed something to them. Obviously, it's met with skepticism by a lot
Right.
of people. But remember, Joseph is living in a time where, Ann Lee's Shakers are
Right.
great in number. Christian Science, Seventh-day Adventists are all blossoming. I think, scientists might have been a little bit later, but people are not all, but many people are claiming visions and founding new movements based upon these visions.
My personal favorite ones, although I can't remember all the details, are the ones who actually come in and claim to be God or
Yes.
claim to be the Holy Spirit. So,
Yeah.
I mean, those are the most entertaining, just for the historical novelty
Yeah, the
of
one
it.
guy, and then the one guy wearing a bear skin who just went from town to town.
You can't make this stuff up. I mean, it's just
I mean, you would get that a lot. Yeah, I am Jesus Christ reincarnated. I am God. Even Joseph never quite does that. Now, as they develop the doctrine of divination, they can say, well, we can be gods one day, but
right.
that's a little different from saying, no, I actually am God right now. Well, you live in a shanty in Vermont. Yeah, I know.
I'm never going to die. Oh, okay. Let's see you
Exactly.
prove that one.
And I guess that's fine because then, by the time people prove you wrong, you're dead. So not good for you after that,
But anyway, yeah. So Joseph has his primary vision, and we need to talk about it in some detail, in Palmyra, right, in the year 1820?
In 1820, yes, Joseph goes into the woods to pray and to ask which church is correct. As he puts it, God the Father and Jesus Christ appear to him and tell him that all the churches are wrong, that all of their creeds are abominations, and
Right.
Joseph is instructed not to join any church. The vision is interesting because we have several different accounts of it, and it all comes much further after the vision.
Right. Yeah, so Joseph basically begins to really emphasize this vision after he's pretty well established as the prophet and is kind of reflecting back on his life, and because he doesn't really tell anybody about it up to that point. And so did it happen the way that he said that it happened? Did it actually happen some other way? Obviously, we would question whether it happened at all.
Yeah, and the datings, because I think it's 1832 before we get that first vision, right? Is it that late? I mean, the first recording.
Something like that, yeah.
Even Joseph's like, well, it was in the early 1820s. Then he narrows it down to 1820. The initial account is that this was his regeneration, that his sins are forgiven directly, so he's good. So those early things, and there's discussions with his family in the 1820s about it, and it kind of sparks a little bit in the family. But the initial emphasis of the vision is that his sins are forgiven. The later accounts emphasize the apostasy of the churches of the world. So, and that's important to understand this development, because initially it's just tell me if this sounds familiar. How can I find relief for my conscience?
I don't know if I've ever heard that story before, Willie.
So it starts with that. And this I'm inclined to believe. He does seem to be plagued as a boy by conscience, if you believe his mother and if you believe other people. He is portrayed as relatively pious. Nobody really seems to throw the money-digging shade at him until he claims to be a prophet. He's not a drunkard. He cusses sometimes. That's what one of the men who hired him to work on his farm, he said occasionally he would say a swear word, paraphrasing. But, he's not religious, but he's spiritual. So, yeah, all right. But he's inquisitive. So he may well have had a burden of the conscience. Now, I'm not saying that this vision's legitimate. I'm saying that might have been true, and that might explain what he's going after at first. How
Right.
can I know my sins are forgiven? It eventually turns into, how can I know which church is true? Well, the answer is none of them, and then this one is the true one, this new one that I've restored. And now he's going to have more visions and more visitations. But nevertheless, that's the first one. Now, Zelwyn, what should we make of these differing accounts?
Yeah, I mean,
we have Smith's account, 1832, 1835, 1838. There's 3 or 4 different Smith accounts. There's Cowdery's, there's the Wentworth letter. So there are all these different versions, and we're trying to piece it together. And you're going to have that difficulty in any kind of historiography.
Right. I think it's fair, like you said, to say that something happened. Obviously, I wouldn't go so far as to say as the actual vision or that God said, don't join any church. But Joseph obviously had some sort of experience that caused him to take this direction.
Yeah. Now, it's at this point, something that pops up in a lot of anti-Mormon books. They'll say, well, he was mentally deranged or epileptic, and so he was having epileptic seizures out there. That's because his grandfather was prone to fits. Okay. Now, his grandfather, though, only had fits after, I think he fell off a horse. He suffers some kind of injury later in life, and that causes him to have fits. So let's put that to rest. So we're faced with a number of things here about Joseph already. Legitimate, confused, or just an outright fraud. Now you see the weakness of using C.S. Lewis's Lord Lunatic or Liar defense, right? Because it's not a defense. Permit me this aside. Everybody uses that as that's like checkmate. No. Lewis's point there is that Jesus is what he says he is. Okay, and you're not really left with too many other options. Either Jesus is who he says he is, or is these other two things. but he presents himself as this. Well, we've turned this into some kind of apologetic, like that is somehow persuasive. But you could say the same thing about anybody who makes these claims. Yeah, he's either the authority that he says he is, a total loon, or he's making it all up.
Right.
Okay, we're left with those options. Is he legitimately deceived? Brody and some others, author Dan Vogel, takes that approach that he's a fraudster who comes to believe his own message, which sounds like a cop-out, but I think we've certainly seen that men can convince themselves of a lot of things, of their own powers. Certainly faithful Mormons believe that these visions are legitimate, and that's the foundation of their faith.
Right.
And then some other people are over there sort of in between, like, well, it's not a vision, but it's not, does he have a dream and he's confused? Does he actually think it speaks to him? But this is what's being fed into him by this revivalism too. There is an account of him relaying, I believe it's the first vision, to a Methodist minister, and the Methodist just basically laughing him out of the room. And that's one of the reasons why we think that maybe Joseph waits a few years to share the story publicly.
Sure.
Because he believed that it would be accepted, and it's not. Again, that's without saying it's true or not true. It's just simply, he seemed to think that whether he's lying or whether it's a legitimate vision, that it was going to be received better than it was.
And that's a good point to point out here too. I think very quickly when we come to an issue of apologetics, we're very quick to jump to the lunacy kind of thing. We're very quick to pass the judgment upon what happened and say, oh, he's just a complete huckster. The whole thing is false. Nothing happened, so on and so forth. But if we're going to deal with what is happening in history, we have to deal with Joseph as he is developing. And that means we have to kind of reserve our judgment for a time. Not that that means that we agree with him or that we think that what is happening is in fact real, but that's just good historiography.
Right. And we do have a lot of, we don't have eyewitness accounts of the visions, but we have eyewitness accounts of a lot of stuff that happened. And that's the tricky part, right?
Right.
Eyewitnesses in court are oftentimes unreliable, yet nevertheless, it seems that Jehovah is satisfied with them because by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, right?
Right.
And so then, okay, now we've got to say, okay, well, how reliable are these witnesses? What do we do here? And that becomes even more interesting, but we'll get into that when it comes to this second vision.
Right.
So the second vision, Joseph Smith is visited by the angel Moroni. Moroni flies in, visits Joseph in his room, and tells him about these golden plates that are hidden, buried out in the forest, or in the hill Cumorah. Yeah, I think it's the hill Cumorah where they're buried.
Right.
So he's told where to go and dig to find these plates. And when Moroni is talking, and this happens a few times, he always says things 3 times. It's like he's really trying to get Joseph to get the point. I find that an interesting little detail, and that's fairly consistent throughout the account. So Moroni comes to him, and Joseph goes and digs up the plates. Okay, this is as the account goes. He tries to take the plates and can't, and is told that he would not be able to until basically he's worthy. It's intimated that Joseph's, at this point, his intentions are not entirely pure, so he is not able to take the plates until a few years later. But he goes and he tells his family about the plates, we know, and so the whole family is really overwhelmed by this in a positive way, and the family is really strong, and his older brother Alvin is really the guy who is behind the discovery of these plates. He's very much, enthusiastically supporting it, the claim.
Right.
Now Alvin has really taken on the fatherly role in the house because Joseph Sr. has gotten older, and it's really kind of a sad story, and you see this in his own accounts, that he's just not able to be a man and be a provider. That's very hard on them, but the family kind of is rallied by Alvin, and then Alvin dies, and the enthusiasm about the plates goes away. Alvin dies, he gets sick, and they try to balance his bile or whatever they're trying to do, and they basically make him swallow mercury, which is lodged in his stomach, and it's not a good death. Yeah, and Alvin's married, he's and everything, and he's got a family, so it's a really hard blow to the family when Alvin dies. Joseph is still young at that point. He's had the 2 visions, but that really puts a damper on things for a while. And then Joseph starts to be sort of the patriarch now, even though Joseph Sr. is still alive. But eventually, Joseph is able to get the plates, and there with the plates, he finds a breastplate and these two stones mounted like spectacles, the Urim and Thummim, which are translation tools. And so then he goes about translating it after he marries his wife, Emma, and they go to Pennsylvania. Now I said Pennsylvania, I feel like we should get Adam in here to comment on it. So, yeah, and I've really I went through that really, really quickly. So they get the plates, they get to Pennsylvania, and he's going to go about translating the book. And so how does he do that? He uses the Urim and Thummim, or the seer's stone. He places them in a hat, puts his face in the hat to block out light, which is the same thing that he did to find treasure, to find lost items, and then sees through it. So the plates are sitting sort of on the table, but he's looking at the stones in the hat. That's what's going on.
Just maybe so that for listeners who might be kind of unfamiliar with all of this, what are these plates supposed to be?
The plates this is what is going to be translated as the Book of Mormon. Okay. So this is what they call a New Testament of Jesus Christ. The Book of Mormon is really the story of ancient Hebrews. It's kind of has its own Old Testament and New Testament. The story of ancient Hebrews coming to America, warring tribes rising and falling. Okay, so that happens. And then Jesus, after his resurrection, visits America and preaches to those people in that book.
Okay.
That's the Book of Mormon. So it's basically Old Testament in America and then New Testament in America.
And so the purpose of the gold plates then was that this account was written down long ago. Who was purported to be the original author?
Well, there's multiple authors. I mean,
there's multiple authors.
Yeah,
okay.
The Book of Mormon, it's basically Mormon sitting down and writing the letters, but then it's multiple books like our Bible.
Okay.
So it's spanning, say, in theory, 2200 BC to like 400 AD.
Okay. I'm just trying to get that clarified for, like I said, for listeners who might not be familiar with the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so he takes these seer stones and he puts his face in the hat, and what does he see in the hat?
He sees the words appear, and then he dictates them to a scribe who writes it down. He had a few different scribes. Martin Harris, I believe his wife Emma actually helps him too, and probably most significantly Oliver Cowdery.
And it was also frequently done behind a curtain, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes, yeah, behind a curtain in another room. He alone with his scribe.
Yeah, so that he would be kind of alone and that there would be this translation work going on. How long did it take him to do that?
He translates in roughly 2 years, so 1827 to 1829, and then printed in 1830, I believe.
But now, of course, we have to ask the question, I think that's maybe pressing for a lot of people dealing with the apologetics issue again. Where did it come from?
Well, I told you it's the ancient record of beginning with the book of Nephi, first Nephi, and ending with Moroni.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that's the other thing and that is what the interesting thing is about it. It's this collection of books, but yeah, is it legitimate? Is it a legitimate translation? Is it a forgery or is it plagiarism?
Especially since it was claimed to have been written in what Joseph called Reformed Egyptian.
Yeah, Reformed Egyptian, which doesn't exist.
Which doesn't exist, but it's also interesting because he's writing it at a time, I think, either right before or right at the time where Champion first deciphers the actual Egyptian hieroglyphics. So you can kind of get away with it saying...
Yeah, we didn't know. And then actually that's interesting, too, once we get into the translation of the Book of Abraham later.
Right.
Which we probably won't, but at the pace we're going. But yeah, that's the question. Does he plagiarize it? Because there are a couple of books that they say he could have borrowed from. Brody says that he gets the gist of it from a book called View of the Hebrews, which is written by a Congregationalist minister, I believe in Vermont, who actually lives at the same time in the same village as Oliver Cowdery, who's going to be one of the scribes of the Book of Mormon.
Right.
Now we're getting into like Alex Jones territory with it, but it does have the same basic idea that the Hebrews came to America,
right,
and that the Indians are descended from the tribes of Israel.
Yeah, because you're still kind of coming out of that time period where not very long after I suppose we've only been on this continent for a couple hundred years by this point, and people are still wrestling with the problem of, well, where do these people come from?
Yeah, and so that's Brody's idea. Obviously, Mormons, Latter-day Saints rather, would disagree with that. One of the things that always gets brought up, and I want to make this clear, again, things to avoid. So there's this it's what's called the Spalding theory, that Joseph stole the story from a novel, an unpublished novel by Mr. Spalding. And we have to go through all these kind of like really weird coincidences and things to get to that theory, but it's become one of the most popular theories, even though no reputable scholar believes it. Mormon or non-Mormon, no scholar, no great historian of Mormon history takes the Spalding theory seriously, and yet it's trotted out in Walter Martin's book still, Ed Decker, who you should avoid at all costs when it comes to Mormonism apologetics. It's trotted out and it's very popular. It just won't die, even though it's totally been discredited.
Sure.
And it basically, it's just this big idea where somebody would have had to get this book manuscript to Joseph in secret over a number of years. And it's actually called the Spalding-Rigdon theory, because they say that Sidney Rigdon, one of Joseph's most prominent early followers, gets the manuscript to him, which is amazing because he would have to get it to him 2 years before they met and before Rigdon even converted. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, don't let historical details get in the way of a good theory.
Right. And they go, well, but see, we found this Spalding manuscript, and he lived in the same town as Sidney Rigdon, and he frequented the print shop where Rigdon worked. So Rigdon totally stole the manuscript from there. Well, it's like, yeah, that's fine, but what you don't realize is they found all this stuff out after they went to do research on anti-Mormon books in the 1860s. So this is all coming out much later, and it's all just too perfect. The timeline doesn't add up. So they go, well, this mysterious stranger was coming in and giving Joseph Smith the materials, and that mysterious stranger was Sidney Rigdon. Once again, how's he traveling from Pennsylvania all the way up to this part of New York as a pastor this entire time, well before his conversion and faking it? It just doesn't add up, and that's why nobody really takes it seriously. The most prominent anti-Mormon authors out there, the reputable ones, the respectable ones, do not take it seriously.
Right.
So we need to stop taking it seriously and avoid that. So we're left with this then. What was it? I don't know. Zelwyn, do we want our personal opinions there or not?
Well, I think if we're going to be honest with it, obviously Joseph produced it. There's obviously no way around that. Whether you believe he translated it or whether you believe that he just made it up, he produced it. Yeah. I think that's the most neutral position you can take.
Sure. I don't believe that he plagiarized. I'm not convinced. Maybe in view of the Hebrews, maybe that framework. And then there's another poetry book where the similarities are like, oh, okay, that's a little odd. But again, there's a lot of things with Joseph, like you have to rely too much on coincidence. Like they'll say, well, he was influenced by Swedenborgianism. Well, how would that even happen? And that's not related to the Book of Mormon. It's just like too much stuff would have to line up. Yeah, I don't believe that it's plagiarized, at least not for the most part. I don't believe that he had help from Oliver Cowdery, or certainly not Sidney Rigdon, and certainly not Martin Harris. I believe it's his product. The Mormons will say, well, see, it has all these different voices in it, so therefore it's proof that he translated it miraculously. You could say the same thing about Faulkner or any author. They'll also say something like Joseph Smith was uneducated, so he couldn't have possibly came up with this on his own. Well, why are we always like giving rural people, just this? It's like the heresy of low expectations. Like he's rural, he doesn't have formal education, he's not stupid, he's not slow, and I don't know what his vocabulary was like. Was it limited? Obviously not. If we believe he wrote the book. So, you have this, but everything to me points to it being not plagiarized, but actually a product of him. And quite frankly, a very ambitious project and impressive. Elephants and steel and stuff aside in that, he's able to make this kind of epic, which is a little bit impressive. You have differences in the Book of Mormon between the printer's manuscript and some later editions, but that's of course going to happen. He's speaking to scribes, so we do have some evidence where he went back and corrected what the scribes wrote down. I don't know that someone else wrote it. What you do have, for example, though, is he lets Martin Harris take 116 pages of the translation, and they get lost, and he's not able to reproduce those pages.
Right.
And so he says, well, now God is punishing us because these are going to fall into the wrong hands. So God gives him like a summary of the book that he wrote, that he had originally translated. You know, you get, okay, so then now we're starting to see some red flags here, right?
Right.
You know, who saw the plates? That's interesting. I do think it's telling. So you have two sets of witnesses, and we're going way over time, but whatever. You have two sets of witnesses, what we call the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses. Even though they all, you know, most of them really fall away from Mormonism, none of them ever deny their testimony of seeing the plates. Now, the plates are described as these golden, it never actually says they're gold, but these golden appearance plates on a sort of a 3-ring binder kind of thing, these 3 metal rings, and then part of the plates are sealed. It's unclear whether the first 3 witnesses actually see a physical book or if it's just a vision, but the other 8 witnesses, now, they all belong to the Smith family or one other family. You know, that's kind of important. They never recant their testimony. Brody says things like, well, Joseph filled his frock coat with a bag of sand and convinced people that it was the book and the plates. I'm like, I don't know. You know, I don't know if I buy that. I think there was certainly some sort of physical metallic book, whether it was a forgery or not. Conveniently, it's not here. According to Joseph, it was taken back up into heaven. And so we don't have it. And so all those things really give me pause. I mean, obviously they would.
Yeah. And maybe just for our listeners' sake, just so that there's no confusion here too, just because we're wondering about, you know, did this happen? Was it real? Was it forgery? That doesn't mean that we're like giving a glowing endorsement of it or something like that.
Yeah, all I'm saying is that Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon is a product of Joseph Smith, and there was probably a physical metallic book.
Right. That doesn't mean that it was right. It just means that there probably was something.
And let's say that Moroni, an angel named Moroni, came to him, gave him actual gold plates, and everything he translated from it was accurate as far as what the plates said. That still wouldn't make it true.
Right.
Because if I or an angel from heaven come with another gospel, right?
Right.
So all these visions and signs could have in theory happened, but they could have been a spiritual deception.
Right.
And, you know, I mean, that's kind of strikes our modern ears wrong, but it's certainly possible. You know, there are malevolent entities out there. So, but hey, we got to take another break. We'll be right back with more Word Fitly. But he said, yea, rather blessed are they that hear the word of God and keep it. You are listening to A Word Fitly Spoken. Hang tight. We'll be right back with more Word Fitly. And we are back talking the life of Joseph Smith. You know, I honestly thought we were going to be able to do this in an hour, but we're actually going to end up doing a second hour, it looks like, on Joseph. So that's all right. That's what happens. We don't want to shortchange this. Now, I realize we are both going into great detail, but also brushing over a lot. So if there is anything you're unclear about, go to Word Fitly posting or go to the Word Fitly Facebook page or the website. And send us questions. You know, I am talking a lot, and, you know, I gave Zelwyn a whole reading list for this. So, you know, he's primed. So I might be speaking in terms we don't understand, or maybe not providing enough detail or context for you. So if we can make anything clearer here, I'd like to know. Also, in the odd chance that a Latter-day Saint's actually listening, if you think that I've unfairly represented the history, then by all means, you know, contact me or contact the Word Fitly Spoken crew. Because we are seeking to do justice here. I mean, we cannot affirm the veracity of Joseph's claim, but I think we can try to be as objective as possible with history. Biased, yes, but at least fairly objective.
Right.
So it is what it is. So we have Joseph. In his context, we have Joseph. He's married now. He's had both visions, been permitted to take the books. He's translated, whatever that means, the Book of Mormon. He borrows money from Martin Harris to get it published. It is published. Then we start to see the church emerge. It is interesting. The Book of Mormon, not a great seller when it first comes out. Mark Twain actually reads it at some point and calls it, well, he calls it boring. I forget his actual words, but dry as wallpaper paste or something like that. I forget what he says. But. So it is what it is. But we begin to see the church emerging. Now, we might not in this segment get to the burning question of polygamy. You might have to wait till the next episode. But we have to get this groundwork out. So the church is formally organized in the home of Peter Whitmer, 6th of April, 1830. And really, the Mormon doctrine begins to develop. At the same time, Joseph begins his revision of the Bible, which is interesting. The Latter-day Saints still uses the King James, but I believe the RLDS, or now the Community of Christ, uses what we call the Joseph Smith translation, which is something that we forget, that Joseph Smith actually undertook a revision of the Bible.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you read much on that at all, Zelwyn, because I don't think Brody really goes into it that much.
No, I not a whole lot, but it's just kind of remarkable that you'd finish writing the Book of Mormon and then undertake to revise the Bible. I mean,
right. Well, as Joseph said, the Book of Mormon is the most perfect book, and the
right.
Bible, and as Mormons believe, the Bible is correct insofar as the Bible is right insofar as it's translated correctly.
Right, which is frankly convenient, but
yeah, very convenient, right? Yeah. Quotaneous subscription, right?
to the Bible.
To the Bible. And I don't want to spend too much time on the Joseph Smith translation, but it does seem like he's actually consulting commentaries and such to do it. Adam Clark's Greek, revision and stuff. He really seems to be following that pretty closely in a lot of places. So there aren't these big revelatory changes. A lot of it is just Adam Clark, Methodist, basically just correcting what he saw as deficiencies in the King James.
Sure.
So British Methodist guy. Anyway.
Very early on in his prophetic career, Joseph Smith is giving all kinds of revelations from the Lord, sometimes on what we might consider rather mundane things.
Yeah. He's receiving revelation. And so, the translations are the Book of Mormon and then Book of Abraham and so on. But then you have these big revelations that are recorded that God, however he does it, gives him these things. So what would be an example of one of those? Do you remember?
If I can remember right, sometimes he would just, if there was a decision to be made in the community, Joseph, especially very early on, would come in and say, basically, thus says the Lord, and then the community would go with that decision because it was a revelation. I don't remember anything specifically, no.
Yeah, the word of wisdom would be one where it's don't eat a whole lot of meat, don't drink really hard drinks, and tobacco for medicinal use for animals only. Mormonism and alcohol is interesting because they're not teetotalers until the 1900s, really. And even Joseph enjoyed some tobacco every now and then, and wine. But yeah, he would receive, and then people would go with it. And it's really, it's interesting to see. And so a lot of these revelations are recorded in Doctrine and Covenants, which is another scripture of the Mormons, of the Latter-day Saints. You see the interpretation of them change over time. It's not unlike the Romanist would do with canon law, or people want to do with the Constitution or something. It's because we're in a different context now, we have to change what these revelations mean. And, I think certain would-be Bible scholars want to do that with the words of the actual scriptures today.
Right.
So, it's kind of funny to see that at play in Mormonism too, which claims to have true and living prophets who should be able to come in and correct them. But that's a discussion for the Mormonism theology episode. At the same time, Joseph, must have believed something about the Book of Mormon, because he actually goes and sends missionaries out to the Indians to basically preach this message to them, which is kind of amazing. To go, here's this book I wrote about your people. This is you guys.
This is your reality.
This is your reality. You weren't always red-skinned. You used to be white, but then you were cursed.
Yeah, that's something I think that we can't really skip over too much. And It's maybe he's going to make Mormons uncomfortable. Maybe it's going to make everybody uncomfortable. But it's just, hey, this is history. We have to deal with it, right? But especially if I remember correctly, the Book of Abraham dealing with the issue of basically where the black race comes from as well as where the Indian race comes from. Do you want to delve into that, Willie?
Well, the Indians, the Lamanites, as they call them, are basically cursed through rebellion. But then you have the blacks who are actually cursed because of Cain. So the blacks are never able to, for the longest time, hold the priesthood, at least not until 1978 in the Mormon Church, until a new revelation, basically because of that. So because of the curse of Ham, curse of Ham, not Cain. The curse of Ham, they're not able to attain really the highest celestial kingdom in Mormon salvation.
Right.
Indians, basically they're originally white, they're cursed, they're red, but if they repent, they can become white and delightsome, as it said. This is going to be the one that gets taken out of context, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much. Much. This is going to be a pull quote in some, heresy case somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Some tribunal. So that's basically the idea there. Racial, curses, which the idea that the curse of Ham is why the black race is black is something you see in other strains of Christianity too.
Right. It wasn't unique to Mormonism at the time.
Yeah, and now the Indian thing kind of is. I'm really trying not to make jokes here, Zelwyn. but nevertheless, yes. So, but they do have a very vigorous mission to the natives at that time. Mm-hmm. Now with limited success, I think, because that would be a bit of a hard pill to swallow for them.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like what we were talking about in the beginning, like coming up to somebody and saying, "Okay, I'm going to tell you everything that you didn't know about yourself." Yeah. It's going to be a hard pill for anybody.
Yeah, exactly. And really, it's right out of the gate. It's not like the Scientologists, right, where you don't learn the secrets till you get way high up in it. This is just pretty much page 1. Yeah, this you. So, yeah, that's what's going on here. Church formally constituted. They're moving you get to move from Pennsylvania, New York, back to New York. All this shuffling's going on. Joseph receives the revelation for the saints together in Ohio, in Kirtland, Ohio. Now, this is where I really begin to be suspicious, because why would God call you to Ohio to set up paradise?
Now we are going to get letters, Willie.
Yeah, so you end up with that, and like I said, folks, we're painting with a broad brush here, skipping over some big details. But so they get into Kirtland, and there's where, and he already has a pretty large amount of followers. He's already sent missionaries out at this point. So the Latter-day Saints are beginning together in Kirtland, Ohio. The numbers are getting very strong. There, he claims to receive the revelation to build the temple. It's also at this time, that Sidney Rigdon really comes on the scene. And Sidney Rigdon is really the great early preacher of the Latter-day Saint movement. And so any history of Joseph Smith is not complete without Sidney Rigdon. If I'm not mistaken, it's actually Sidney Rigdon who coins the term Latter-day Saint.
I'd have to take your word on it.
Rigdon's an early follower of Alexander Campbell, probably the other most famous restorationist at this time. Alexander Campbell's a primitivist. If you want to go see his sons, you just need to go to a Disciples of Christ, a Christian church, or a Church of Christ. Those are the historic heirs of Alexander Campbell. His church was called the Church of Christ. Also, at this time, Joseph's church is called the Church of Christ. It becomes very confusing. And it's still very confusing. Remember, what Alexander Campbell means by the Church of Christ is that he had restored the true Church of Christ, that everyone else was an apostate. That's also what Joseph Smith meant. But we want to make that clear. This is not some juicy ecumenism, okay? This is not saying we're the Church of Christ, we're all open. They're saying we are the, emphasis on the, true Church of Christ on earth. And so we're taking back the trademark on the original name.
Even to the point of Joseph making the claim that they are actually Israel. Not even in a spiritual sense, but they are actually Israel.
They are true Israel, yeah. And this is significant for Joseph's theology, and something that since we're talking about Campbell, that would be good. See, Alexander Campbell has a mild dispensationalism.
Mm-hmm.
He cannot see really any continuation between the Old and New Testaments. He truly sees a different plan of salvation in the Old Testament as in the New. Joseph is different. Joseph sees one continuous plan all throughout the Old and New Testament. So he is not the dispensationalist like Campbell is. And I'm using that term loosely, and you can do that at this time period.
Sure.
For Campbell, very much clear, there's really nothing for us in the Old Testament as far as application for the Christian. I mean, he's kicked out of the Presbyterians and then kicked out of the Baptists for saying that the Ten Commandments do not apply in any way to Christians. Yeah. And now we're back to a third use debate, right? But beyond that, I mean, I don't know that he even believes in a first or second use. But Joseph doesn't see that. He sees that connection, and that's why his building of temples makes a little bit more sense if you see it that way.
Sure.
So in Kirtland, Ohio, they're going to build the first Mormon temple. Now, the temple is interesting because temples actually precede meeting houses or churches in the Latter-day Saint movement. So you actually have the temple stuff being developed before that. The temple is where a Latter-day Saint will go and perform elaborate rituals in order to achieve, say, eternal sealing in heaven, in order to receive baptism for the dead, which is not instituted at this time. That's later in Nauvoo, Illinois. But it's where they'll go and perform all these rituals to achieve something. It's not unlike... It's meant to be similar to the Old Testament temple where you would go and a priest would perform a sacrifice and you would receive remission of sins.
Just for the sake of clarity. So What you're saying is that the typical Mormon churches that, the average listener might see as they're driving by, those are not temples, right?
Those are not temples. A temple is different. There's less than 200 temples in the world now, which is a lot more. I want to say 160 something. As of right now, but don't quote me on that. Their aim is to get to 200 by a certain year, and they're very aggressive about that. Yeah, a temple is a special place where, as a Latter-day Saint, you are obligated to go and perform these temple ordinances, but it's different from the church. So a Mormon church, or a Mormon, meeting house, I forget the correct terminology right now, that is not the temple. And those actually come later, because for a lot of times, regular Sunday meetings are not a thing, because the group's so spread out, or if they are meeting, they're meeting in houses or meeting in fields. So the temple, now the building of the Kirtland Temple is significant, and that's something to talk about because when it's built, there are literally hundreds of accounts of seeing angels flying in and out. People see, Moses and God talking to Joseph Smith in the temple. I mean, hundreds of these accounts. And you wonder, what kind of mass hallucinations going on here.
Or something, yeah.
Are people, what kind of deception this is, or what kind of apparitions these are. Prior to the founding of the temple, though, I should point out that the apostles come and bestow priesthood authority on Joseph Smith. So what you start to see is this idea that the priesthood is being restored, the Aaronic priesthood, the priesthood of Aaron, and then what they call the Melchizedek priesthood. So you have these two priesthood classes restored, which is important, because when you have temple, what do you need? You
need the temple ritual.
Priests. Yeah, or you got to have the priests, right?
Right.
So you have Joseph Smith claiming that he received apostolic authority and priesthood authority from, these heavenly beings, and then you get to the building of the Kirtland Temple. People are flocking in to see this temple. It is, in its time, a very beautiful building. Actually, not owned by the Latter-day Saints today. It's actually owned by one of the breakaways, the Community of Christ. And in that temple, you have these rituals performed. It's sort of rudimentary in Kirtland. We see it develop more in Nauvoo. So that's happening. They're all coming here. At this time, there's also a big real estate boom in the United States. The market economy is doing well, and so Joseph decides to found a bank in Kirtland. Do you have any comments before I start going off on a tangent about Joseph again?
About Joseph? Well, the whole thing is a tangent about Joseph, so...
Right. Joseph, he's not a Martin Stephan type character who is depicted as sitting in his house while everybody else is out toiling in the fields, to build his house. Joseph is a storekeeper. Joseph is a cashier. Joseph is doing he actually has a lot of side hustles going on. And that's what you see all throughout his life. In addition to religious stuff, it's just like the money taking. He always had some other job going on to try to make ends meet. And so one of the things that happens in Kirtland is the bank.
Well, and maybe one of the great reasons for the bank is something that we alluded to earlier in the episode, that having so many side hustles as he did, he was always perpetually broke.
Yeah, the guy's broke. He's making bad investments. He'll open a store and he can't get it to work. Is it because he's a starry-eyed dreamer? He's too, is he too busy, writing down these supposed revelations? We don't know. There's no indication that he's lazy by any stretch of the imagination.
By no means, yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like he's too busy, and that's why he fails in business enterprise. So, huge following. Everybody's putting their money in this bank, and then there's a banking crisis
across the United States.
It's not like just that one bank and he absconded with the funds. What happens is, he goes bust because all these banks are going bust. He makes all these prophecies about prosperity coming, not like a Creflo Dollar kind of thing, but he makes these and about all these good things coming, and then this goes bust, and they actually totally turn on him. The members come in, they want to seize the temple. They have guns, they have swords. They're going to take the temple by force, and Joseph is forced to flee. But by that time, he's already sent expeditionary followers out to Missouri to look at forming another colony in Missouri, which is where things are really going to go haywire with the Mormon extermination order. But in Kirtland, Brigham Young says that at one point, I don't believe there were more than 10 people who believe in the prophet. That's how dire the situation becomes in Kirtland. And basically, Kirtland is abandoned.
Since we're kind of coming towards the end of this episode anyway, maybe that's a good way of showing that as we're dealing with Mormon history, this is not like a hagiography, that there was one triumph from one thing to another. No, Joseph Smith faced a lot of very serious problems throughout his life, his relatively short life, too.
Yeah, and as long as we're in Ohio, they're ran out of town. They receive threats wherever they go. And this is where lesser Mormon books are going to say, well, it was because the Mormons were making threat and he was like Muhammad, and that was an epithet common to, newspapers call him the American Muhammad. Mm-hmm. I don't know that we're going to get into that because Sidney Rigdon plays into that a little bit later about threats, but this all comes later in Nauvoo. They're ran out from place to place. Smith is actually tarred and feathered at the same time. So this is before the banking crisis. Smith is actually tarred and feathered. It's kind of a quaint punishment, but it's a horrible punishment to have burnt molten tar poured on you. So actually, if you look at the few portraits we have of him in his time, you'll notice like on his left side, his hair's kind of combed forward. And that's actually to cover up a scar, a pretty severe scar he got from the tarring and feathering. But yeah, everywhere you go, he's either persecuted for whatever, thrown out. It's a really sad story as tarring and feathering. If we want to talk about the opposition that he faced and the fact that his life wasn't easy. They break into his house at night, basically drag him out. They take his kid, and he has a very young adopted son at that point, maybe 6 years old. I don't think it's 6 months. I think it's 6 years. They take Joseph out. He's tarred and feathered, left for dead, nearly does die. The child actually contracts a disease from exposure because of that, because they left the child unattended, and dies as a result of it. It's just a tremendous series of misfortunes that he suffers through this. And what that serves to do is he doesn't waver from his message then. That serves to galvanize his followers around him. And so I'm not making this into a hagiography, and lifting him up, but I'm here saying that his life is a turbulent life and that he was suffering with them to a great degree that endeared him to his followers. And so we can't discredit that. And nevertheless, though, after all that, when the Kirtland fiasco happens, he loses almost all of them, but quite quickly builds his base back up again because he does have a significant number of followers in Missouri. So we got as far as Ohio. So just a quick recap, Zelwyn, what do we want the readers to, or the listeners to take away from this first hour?
I think the most important things to take away from this is Joseph's early life and the struggles that he faced and the kind of person that he was. And then also the nature of what it took for him to actually start this movement in that particular time period, especially that was washed over with all kinds of, similar kind of movements. His own personal magnetism and all of that, as well as the beginning of his personal struggles, which I think, as our listeners are going to find out as we go forward, are only going to increase.
Yeah.
This is not something that, this was a little hiccup and now it got better. Yeah. No, it gets worse.
Stick around, when we do the second hour, because It's very important, for American history. You're going to see a governor of a state put out an extermination order and actually try to carry it out, an extermination order against a certain religious group. You're going to see all kinds of stuff. The relationship between militias and cities and states, it's very interesting. And then we're going to get into those great theological differences and heresies, divinization, the rejection of the Trinity, what that means, in Mormon theology. We're going to talk about baptism for the dead, polygamy, all those hot button issues when it comes to the Latter-day Saint movement. But for now, we are out of time. This has been A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm Willie Grills here with Zelwyn Heide. If you like what you heard, check us out, wordfitlyspoken.org, facebook.com/wordfitly, or Twitter @wordfitly. Thank you for listening. God love you, and God bless. I have intended my remarks for all, both rich and poor, bond and free, great and small. I have no enmity against any man. I love you all. I'm your best friend, and if persons miss their mark, it is their own fault. If I reprove a man, and he hates me, he is a fool. For I love all men, especially these brethren and sisters. I rejoice in hearing the testimony of my aged friends. You never knew my heart. No man knows my history. I cannot tell it. I shall never undertake it. If I had not experienced what I have, I should not have believed in myself. I never did harm any man since I have been born into the world. My voice is always for peace. I cannot lie down until all my work is finished. I never think any evil nor do anything to the harm of my fellow man. When I am called at the trump of the archangel and weighed in the balance, you will all know me then. I add no more. God bless you all. Amen. Joseph Smith, The King Follett Discourse.